So, have you ever heard that story and wondered how exactly did it work? I mean, did Jesus just like bless the bread up front and then like thousands of loaves came out and multiplied before their eyes, so much so that they had to recruit disciples using wheelbarrows to pass out the bread? Or was it kind of like a never emptying basket where as soon as a loaf would it disappear, another one would suddenly reappear. I grew up with the story of the crowd had a little bit of food tucked away in their pockets. And that they had, if you had gone on a long journey to follow Jesus, you certainly would have a little bread tucked in your pocket after breakfast, maybe some raisins, some figs. I would certainly have a PB&J in my pocket. And who wouldn't pack some food? And so when Jesus healed and taught, the crowd saw the basket with only 5 loaves and 2 fishes, thought, someone needs it more than I, and then took whatever was in their pockets, bread of all sorts of types, and said, you know what, here's part of my share. I grew up with that story. I seem to remember it fondly, thinking, that makes sense to me. But when I got to seminary, I had a professor who was like, oh, you're underestimating God's ability to have a miracle. That the power of God is more incredible than what mankind makes of it. I've been really thinking about that perspective in the last few weeks, and the pandemic, like many of you, has kind of changed how I feel about the world and what I think about things going on. And I've really begun to rethink my professor's well-meaning idea as just maybe not what I'm thinking of today. What I really miss since the time of the pandemic is a meal with friends. I really miss that. That is a big part of Tom's and my lifestyle. I love to cook. He loves to eat. We love to have friends over for meals. And I just kind of miss that sense of tucking in with good food and good conversation and sharing that sense of what's going on in our lives. It was a way of being fed both spiritually and through the body. Another piece of that is I really miss communion. I miss sharing the bread and the wine with all of you, sharing in that simple task of eating together, being fed both soul and body all at the same time. That whole sense of just hunkering down and tucking in with friends has just kind of disappeared, hasn't it? I eat with friends online. I eat with my family oftentimes in North Carolina online or on Zoom, but it just doesn't quite feel the same. And we're going to do spiritual communion, and as beautiful as it is, it just really isn't quite the same. I've begun to really think about that story and the pandemic, and that we believe in a God that wants to feed our soul and our body. And I begin to think of that sense of the humans in that field that day, in the desert of their lives, seeking healing, seeking something for their soul, being willing to turn their pockets inside out for others as quite possibly a miracle of its own. Why isn't that a glorious God-given miracle? In the days where we feel like we're just kind of hunkering down into our own houses and into our own lives, kind of hoping for this pandemic to end, and realizing how many of us are without food or without work or without home these days, the sense of human beings in a massive 5,000 turning their pockets inside out, being generous, being giving, does sometimes feel like a miracle. We live in this world right now where there is lots of scarcity. We have people who are leaning into the fear leaning into finding ways to protect themselves. And of course, that makes sense. We all must do what we can to protect ourselves. But does that mean so much so that we can't share with others? Leadership styles certainly seem to be more tuned into the upcoming election than actually trying to figure out ways to help our nation get through this. It was a miracle that day, especially if the humans, everyone, turned their pockets inside out, leaning into that plenty versus the scarcity, overcoming the fear and the need to protect themselves to giving to others. Barbara Brown Taylor, in her book about Matthew's parables, talks a lot about how we as Christians sometimes like to lean into the miracles as if we're just waiting for God's miraculous action to come and fix our problems. That we as Christians sometimes might think that we're let off the hook because, well, we're not Jesus and we're not God. Barbara Brown Taylor asks us, that's kind of the problem with miracles. Maybe we ought to be part of the miracle. So I'm asking us today, how can you be part of the miracle? The miracle that this world right now needs. To lean into a sense of giving and to lean into a sense of sharing and to lean into the sense of abundance. The story comes shortly after the parable of the mustard seed, where a little teeny tiny seeds becomes an abundance for all of kingdom come, the birds that flock into its tree leaves. This, having the same sense, only 5 loaves, has an abundance to feed the hearts and the souls of thousands. How can you today be part of the miracle that God is asking us of us? How can you be part of that radical vision of love? Amen.